And good morning, everyone from Stockholm. You are most welcome to this lecture in our China lecture series. My name is Torbjörn Lodén, and I'm the head of the Stockholm China Center, which is part of the ISDP, the Institute for Security and Development Policy. One of our activities is to organize lectures, which during the pandemic have all been virtual. But we also organize seminars and conferences, produce shorter and longer papers on topical issues, and so on and so forth. Our speaker today is Ambassador Bengt Johansson. Bengt is one of the most knowledgeable and experienced people in Sweden as far as Sino-Swedish trade is concerned. I have known Bengt since the early 1970s, when he was a young economist and civil servant working for the Swedish Trade Council, with the task to promote Sino-Swedish trade. At that time, I was posted as a young sinologist at our embassy, at the Swedish embassy in Beijing. Since then, since the early 1970s, Bengt has had a distinguished career, mainly in the Swedish Foreign Ministry, serving in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. In Shanghai, he was consul-general during 2 periods. Towards the end of his career in the Foreign Ministry, he served as Ambassador for Corporate Social Responsibility, CSR. And after his retirement, he has been an adjunct professor at Shanghai University. Outside his professional duties, Bengt has engaged in research and written books. We could think of him, to use a Chinese concept, as a scholar official. For example, he is one of the leading experts in Sweden on Macau. But his most recent book deals with Swedish companies in China. And this is also what he's going to talk about today, as you all know. The topic of his lecture is "The Past Was Brilliant and the Future Uncertain," about Swedish companies in China. This is the English translation of the title of his book, which he wrote in Swedish, but which we hope will also soon become available in English and perhaps, hopefully, also in Chinese. And now, Bengt, before I ask you to begin your lecture, I would like to ask you to say a few words about why you decided to write this book. What are the most important reasons why you think there is a need for this book?
Thank you, Torbjörn, for this introduction. It is a little difficult sometimes to describe why you want to publish a book, but very briefly, when you have worked for Swedish companies, Swedish interests your whole life, and also being paid by taxpayers' money, you want to give something back. You want to make something of a history and some conclusions of your work. And you have to hurry up, because when you leave retirement, you have to a couple of years to when you are still fresh, you still remember everything, and before it's getting a bit foggy. So I use this time, and I have, of course, during pandemic, had problems sometimes to travel and to meet people. But basically, what I'm talking about is what has happened until now. I have not trying to forecast the future. And therefore, it is rather easy also to reach people by telephone, people I know. Most of these people I know quite well. So that is the reason. And if I then should continue to say something about the book, maybe I wanted to share a couple of slides here. And if I do like this, and I start from the beginning. So this, this is the book. And as you can see, there is a photo of a Swedish factory, our first joint venture factory on the cover. That is a pharmaceutical factory in Wuxi. And I use this as a cover photo, as even if it is now sold to a German company, the name SSPC, Sino-Swede Pharmaceutical Corporation, is still, as you see on the board, and the Swedish flag is flying. So that was that is the cover of the book, and it also shows here some of the data, the publishing house, how it is sold. It says here, I hope to publish an English edition early 2022. I wanted first to find out if there were any comments, something I got wrong, and so far I have not got any such signal from these people I have interviewed. And then here is something about the content. As you can see here, I have researched 50 Swedish companies, which is not even more than a small fraction, because we have more than 400 companies here in Sweden that have subsidiaries in China. But 45 of these 50 I have been able to interview. Difference of 5 companies are, some companies maybe didn't answer my questions. Some companies I could make an interview, but they had nothing to say of interest, or they were not interested in saying anything. And but anyhow, these 45 companies I have interviewed have a total of 112,000 employees in China, and half are large companies, large being companies on our stock markets, large company section, and half of them are small and medium-sized companies. And I also wanted to point out that I have no external funding, either from companies or institutions. I could also explain why I have this policy, but the most obvious reason is, of course, I want to be able to make an independent study. Nobody should dictate what I want, what I should write. And that is the big problem in Swedish business history research, that it is based on funding from the companies you are going to write about. Now, before I talk more about the content, I should say something about our trade. Here you see a very solid increase, a robust increase year after year. It looks fantastic up to now. Our figures, last figures is 2020. But of course, if somebody would like to know how is it with other comparable countries. And here is another graph where you can see the blue line for China surging far quicker than other countries. And Poland, for example, here is up to about 2005, keeping pace with China, but then it is after 2008, it's falling behind. Not to mention Japan, Russia, Spain as were in the beginning on the same level as China. The other question, of course, people are asking me is who are the companies who are behind this export? Who is company interest in when we form our China policy? And here I have another graph where I have the full trade, 100% full exports, and divided into various categories using the statistical SITC. So you can identify a lot of this is different kinds of machinery. It is group 72, 74, 75, 76, and so on. But the most obvious is, of course, that during a long period of time from early 90s to 2010, our major export item was telecom equipment from Ericsson. And that still lingers in our memory, even if today, as you see, the big export items are vehicles and pharmaceuticals. This division into 10 years is also what I'm trying to do in my book, because I found that this is actually the stages in Chinese development. 1980 was the introduction of market by Deng Xiaoping. 1990, the big question, how is China going to do after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989? 2000 is China is about to enter the WTO. 2010 is interesting because some of us were at Shanghai World Expo, but you see here that this is the only period when all sectors have equal share. That is, there is not one company in Sweden that you can say is the China factor. It is rather difficult if you would like really to form foreign policy based on company interests. You have a lot of companies to turn to. And now 2020, this year, of course, marks the big turning period in China's economic relations. And we don't know about the future. And this is what I found out looking back. It has changed so often, and nobody has been able to forecast how it will be in the future. Okay, so having said that, then I would like to go back to my presentation. And Torbjörn mentioned that we met in the 1970s. And I would like to mention one of the big things, of course, was, for me personally, was to be able to lead the work of introducing Swedish companies in the 1970s. That was a deal struck after our first exhibition, 1972, that Swedish companies should be introduced through the CCPIT and the Swedish Trade Council. We had an excellent cooperation with the CCPIT, which stands for China Council for Promotion of the International Trade. It still exists, but of course there are now so many other organizations. But at that time, it was the arm for the Chinese governments to invite foreign companies. And we had so good relations that I recall when we were invited to take part in the small multinational exhibition on agriculture, we asked them, how come you were so kind to us, because we are not a country known for agricultural machinery. And they said, whenever we do something, we always reserve a place for our Swedish friends. And based on that, we had at that time quite a success in China, I would say. And even if I left Trade Council after quarreling with my president, which I describe in the book, I was immediately recruited by the Foreign Ministry or the Ministry of Commerce because they wanted to start a China trade activity. And then I found this is not as easy, because then we had to deal with Chinese ministries. And they had, of course, to keep relations on par with other countries, sovereign countries, be it Indonesia or India or Pakistan or so on, and could not give preference to a single country, old friend in Europe. So it was difficult, but we still maintained our role of being the first country to do a lot of things. And I have been asked by Swedish businessmen, why did you, from Swedish side, insist on trying to be number one always when China entered an agreement on double taxation or on investment promotion or whatnot? And I said, well, as we started very early, first country, Western country with diplomatic relations, first country to have an industrial exhibition after the Cultural Revolution, it was very logical for us to continue. And you don't want to break having a pole position if you are in a rally. So that is actually the reason how we could start and why we had so many companies out there so early in the 1970s. And then I would like to mention a couple of issues. People are now talking mostly about what is happening right now. This is everybody's concern. I mention a few issues that I have raised in the book. The first real problem I had was how to describe the Ericsson history in China. They have, of course, written their own history. A nice book published 2 years ago about their relation with China. It doesn't mention Huawei, doesn't mention a lot of things. Everything is just fine. But we know it is a bit complicated. And what I would mention as the real problem today is that Ericsson has been doing everything as good as they could, but they are now taken hostage by the Chinese government for Swedish government's rejection of Chinese supplies to the 5G network. It's not Ericsson's fault. I know some people at Ericsson and I've told them, well, I'm sorry for you, but you must understand the Swedish public is worried about foreign components in the 5G network. And hopefully you understand this, it's not your fault. I hope Ericsson can stay on. Next thing is the 6G standard setting. And that will be very crucial if Ericsson and the Chinese partners can agree on this. Another issue that is very hot today is the H&M issue. I have not mentioned this so much in the book because it developed in late March this year, when I had basically finished the book. It's also complicated, but I know H&M very well from my time as CSR ambassador. They are really, as I understood, the first Swedish brand that has taken CSR seriously. They were first to launch the agreement on Bangladesh, for example. However, they say they have to tell the Chinese that if we should buy cotton from Xinjiang, we have to inspect to see how it is produced. That was refused, and they have made a statement supporting the Better Cotton Initiative. And now it's frozen. You cannot find H&M products on e-commerce platforms. So I don't know how this will end, but in difference from the Ericsson case, this is actually the policy of our companies here that is causing the problem. And I don't see any reason why this policy from our companies would change. When you see the debate among multinationals on sustainability. And another issue that I would like to mention that is very topical today is the problems that face the education sector. That happened after I finished this book. I interviewed the EF, which is called Education First. It was called before English First. That is the second largest employer of Swedish companies in China. But in June, there was a kind of instruction from the Education Commission that foreign companies could not run after-class tuition for Chinese kids. And later on, some companies, foreign companies who tried to do this from abroad online were blocked. The Italian-owned company Wall Street closed its activities in China. And we have on one hand the policy called Common Prosperity to equalize and no favors to rich people. On the other hand, we have the distaste for foreign companies in general, in public. So I feel it's a pity. I feel that I can't see in whose interest it is to prevent young Chinese to study English. So therefore, I highlighted now 3 problems that are topical in the papers today. That underlines a bit the worry I feel, why I choose the headline, "The future is uncertain." I also said things might change, maybe not during my active years, but sooner or later there will be a change. China will turn to the outside world and will be keen on sharing, having international contacts. If I go on and talk a little about some of the company issues that I have been dealing with, I have in the book mentioned, for example, the issues where Swedish companies have different strategies. You all know that we have 2 truck manufacturers, or truck and bus manufacturers, Volvo and Scania. You can't tell the difference really here, from a Swedish perspective, but have chosen different strategies in China. Volvo has been keen to launch its own companies producing buses first and then trucks. Scania has hesitated, no own production if we can't have 100% control. Lately now they have got the permission to have a truck production 100% owned by Scania, but that will still some way to go, of course, pandemic and everything. It should be open maybe in 2-3 years. But there is a striking difference between these 2 companies who for us here are very similar. I have in the book also given examples of same differences with our 2 large forest companies, SCA and Stora Enso. SCA is a company that runs forest management only in Sweden. And in order to market their main products, export product, which is soft tissue, in China, they entered into an agreement with a Chinese company. And under that company's brand name, they succeeded as an owner to get and maintain an interesting share of the Chinese market. Stora Enso, on the other hand, traditional forest company, have always tried to run forest management abroad. And they have, for example, in countries like Brazil, they have large forests, and they have invested in a large forest projects in China too, in Guangxi. A completely different strategy. But for us, maybe here, same kind of forest companies. In the book, I also mentioned a couple of other interesting strategies, market entry strategies. One is, for example, the mergers and acquisitions. If you are in a mature market, you cannot grow organically, adding percent after percent. You have to try to get a bigger chunk, and that is the case of Assa Abloy, that bought a number of Chinese lock producers, which is not easy to buy a company. I mean, the valuation issue and so on. So they had to cut down the assets in China by 5 billion kroner a couple of years ago. Another interesting market strategy is when you only have the premium market, and if you want to expand into the mid-range market, how to do. And I have interviewed, for example, Atlas Copco, that has 4 other brands owned by Atlas Copco, but on not premium brands, so less 100% of perfection and less service and so on. And other companies have followed this kind of double brand strategy. That has been an interesting way to survive. And now these are what I have described, a couple of different strategies. And I have found, if I should make a very quick summary, when I interview people who has been successful, there is only one recipe, and that is hard work and a lot of interest. I'm surprised when I interview people who are 70 plus, 80 plus, who have been managers. They still remember every name of their staff. They remember who was excellent, who was not so excellent. They have taken a keen interest. And of course, it's a lot of work behind it. I am a little worried about the future because today, if you want to be a manager in China, you probably have to speak Chinese. And who can do that? Less and less people study Chinese. I made a research into our university's enrollment and got a little worried, actually. In the old days, of course, you could have a driver, you could have an interpreter and everything like that. It worked well, but today companies can't afford it. The next problem is, of course, we have now, due to pandemics, a problem for companies to bring in spouses and children to our managers. And suddenly we are back in 1990s. At that time, companies could only send bachelors to China because spouses who at that time were usually women didn't like to go. And for children, there were no schools. Pandemic maybe will drive us back to a situation that was that we know from that time. So yeah, there are problems in the future, actually, what to do, and I really want everybody to try and see if there are possibilities. And my result of my study is that there are so many ways, so many different ways you can still do manufacturing in China for export. I have the case of Ålö Machinery that's doing that. And you have other companies that maybe are divesting and moving supply chain to other countries. So not generalize, look at every case exactly from its own premises. So now I have spoken, we have taken half our time, and I'm eager to know if maybe there are any comments or questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Bengt, for this interesting, really very interesting presentation. As Bengt just said, we now invite all our attendees to raise questions or make comments. And we ask you to do that under the Q&A button, which you will find on the bottom of the page. Before opening the floor for questions, I would like to raise a very general question for you, Bengt, a question from somebody who is not at all into problems related to Swedish companies in China. You reminded me yesterday that you started to work for the Export Council back in 1974. If at that time I would have asked you, what do you think economic relations between China and Sweden will be like in 2021? What would you have answered? This, of course, is part of the larger and impossible question. What did you think at that time about the development of China? How did you envisage the future of China?
Thank you for that impossible question. I will try to give, may I first say that at that time we thought perhaps of development in China along the same lines as we thought of Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. And I remember around 1981, I was offered to be commercial counselor at the embassy. And I said no, thank you, for family reasons. But my second thought was I would like to come back much later, maybe after 10, 15 years. China will then be an open society. There will be interesting discussions. Things must be different at that time. And in some way I regret this, because the early 80s were fantastic years. I remember even 78 during the democracy ball, you could talk to anybody about anything. And then this isolationist movement caught strength, and it has, I would say, perhaps from 2000, it has been more and more difficult every year. So in that time, we thought, of course, China will open. It will open more and more and more. That was the general feeling. We had, of course, backlashes. We had the backlash after Tiananmen 1989. I remember I came to Beijing in 91 to the embassy, and the general feeling at that time was the country is closing down, back to the Cultural Revolution, and so on. And then Deng Xiaoping made his visit to South China, which I describe in the book as a turning point, and suddenly the market economy is back. How could anybody foresee that? That is why your question is impossible to answer. I can only give you the feeling we had at the time.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's interesting to recall the feelings that you had and the feelings like people like myself also have. I sometimes tend to forget how I myself looked at China 40 or 50 years ago. But I think it's important to keep the historical perspective alive, historical perspective of our own lifetime, but of course also a longer historical perspective. I can notice that Ola Wong and Börje Ljunggren have raised their hands. Would you like to raise a question, Ola?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you?
The policy to open party committees in every company. I wonder, has Swedish companies been affected by that? I understand there has been a backlash from foreign companies against this drive, but I wonder how and if Swedish company has been affected. Have it set up party committees, and what role does it have in that case?
Yeah, thank you, Ola. Now, when I was last time in China, before pandemic, this was not an issue. We have seen this wish to have party committees in companies for many years. I would say it is not the most important issue for companies. They, of course, have to follow Chinese laws and have good contacts with the local officials and so on. I'm not quite sure that it is a relevant question in the same way as it is not so relevant if you have a Chinese trade union or not. If you are a foreign company in China, you probably have now, after what we have seen with H&M and other companies, you have to follow the local rules, whoever passes on the message to you. This is, I think, the situation we have to face. Thank you. Can we have the same for Börje Ljunggren? Same procedure?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay, I think we should proceed to more questions. We have one written question from Julian Tucker, who writes, "Thank you for the very interesting presentation." Yeah. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. Could you elaborate a little bit in the historical legacy of Swedish Nordic companies in China? To what degree has the business community been able to draw on existing pools of expertise and capitalize on the reputation of Nordic business?
Well, as soon as you want to compare Swedish companies with other countries, I go back to my period in the EU Commission when at that time we had first 15 and then 25 members, and I had the opportunity to talk with representatives from these countries about their China trade policy. And I found that there is no reason for us to boast and brag about us being very particular. You'll find that in France, Germany, Italy, and so on, they do the same thing. For example, I mentioned I was sitting there receiving representatives from various countries, and one day an Englishman came and said, "You know, we have particular relations with China." "Oh yes, indeed, please go on." And they said, "Hong Kong." Okay. And next week I had a representative from Portugal who said, "You know, sir, we have very special relations with China." And I said, "Oh yes, please tell me." "Macau, yeah, of course." And then another week, a Danish representative came and said, "You know, we have fantastic relations with China. We were the second Western country to open diplomatic relations." And I could hardly hide that who was the first Western country. So every country thinks they're doing something spectacular. Your question about do we capitalize on expertise, do companies capitalize on expertise? I think they do, but it's not always you can integrate sinologists in the company culture. And I notice, for example, in my book, I write about the Swedish bank Handelsbanken that has recruited sinologists, artisan journalists, and they say, "We want our man in Beijing to understand China. Banking, we know ourselves." And that H&M had the same policy in the beginning, I remember. I think at that time, yes, they did capitalize. Then we had a period of very good tuition at some of our universities. For example, Lund University had a Southeast Asia program. And I have met so many company managers who started doing that Southeast Asia program and then immediately got a job in China. But today there are hardly any such programs left, unfortunately. I'm not worried about the past, I'm worried about the future.
Thank you, Bengt. Börje Ljunggren and Kalle Halding have raised their hands. Börje, please go ahead. You are muted, Börje. Can you unmute yourself? In that case, I think for the time being, we move on to Kalle Halding. Can you hear us? And can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I have unmuted myself.
Good.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please. Sorry, we made a mistake here. Can you begin again, please?
Okay. All right. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Bengt, for your review here of Swedish companies' opportunities and history of working in China. Really nice to listen to you. I have a question which I'm not really sure that you touched upon, but it's given the current Chinese regime's aggressive efforts to overturn the kind of Western hegemony on individual and human rights, and how we try to uphold basic civil liberties, and how should Swedish companies navigate this increasingly conflictual world where global norms, I could say the global norms that really underpin an open and free global trade, where these global norms is at stake? Thanks.
Yeah, I would first answer that I often got the question from companies, what shall we say to our Chinese guests next week about something, whatever, Tibet or something. I always told them, don't talk about foreign policy, let us handle that. You talk about your company business, stick to that. And the same, I would, if somebody asked me today, how shall our company sort of comment on these things that you mentioned, I would say you can probably leave that to the government and just run your own policy. Now, of course, I also mentioned that I was ambassador for corporate social responsibility. So I have some views on what companies should do, which concerns the public sphere, what they should not do. And I think I can tell you that I was worried in the beginning that our companies in China were not in tune with their head office policies. Because I remember from the 1980s, you could talk to Swedish company managers saying that, well, if they knew at the head office what we were doing here, we would all be fired. So when I had assumed the job as ambassador for corporate social responsibility, my first instinct was to check a little. Are companies' headquarters aware of what they are doing in China? Are they in control? Yes, they are. That was my conclusion. Today, our companies follow strictly the head office policies in whatever issue it is. So I'm not worried about so much about that, but I have, of course, to admit that the interest among corporate representatives in China could be different than what they are in Sweden. For example, I ran a seminar on business and human rights in Shanghai in 2000, I think it was 14. And there was not one comment by the company representatives. And later I went around and asked them, for heaven's sake, are you not interested? And they said, we see no problem with human rights in China. Why should there then be a problem for our company? So there were a lot of people had gone native and they had no enthusiasm. When I started this book, my first idea was to give a voice to Swedish company representatives in China. Due to pandemics, I had to make more interviews here in Sweden, and I was also influenced by the mood here. So I changed sort of a little the theme, and I now see, of course, the company's head office line to take as more important for me, more closer to our political reality. But I understand the issue on the ground. How do you put this into practice? I understand that this is not easy. I don't know if that answers your question, but I would like to mention that I have in my book a chapter on sustainability, which I think is interesting, because this is the last thing I did in China. That was to teach at the Shanghai University. So I have rather fresh impressions of the normal Chinese thinking on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, Kalle, for your interesting question. I now take a written question from Larissa Stinkel, who writes, "Thank you for this very interesting presentation. Could you elaborate on how Swedish companies are perceived in China?"
Well, I have not studied this. My study is how Swedish companies look upon themselves and what they are doing. I have not interviewed Chinese officials. I have, of course, since I came back, been a bit struck by the attitude in the statements from the Chinese embassy here, which we all know. But if you ask me about the feeling in China about Swedish companies, I put this question sometimes to my class at the University of Executive MBAs. And the general feeling I got was, yes, they support their own company. If it's a foreign company, let it be it Austrian or French or Italian, they say, my company is best in the world in the corporate social responsibility. And if I ask them, so what do you think about other companies? And they say, no idea, I only look at my company. So therefore, there's no point really in interviewing our own employees. They are probably very loyal and support our case. If you go out into society, you would probably find that they know quite little about foreign companies. They mix us up, companies as well as countries, with other foreign entities. So we have not a distinct image. I think this is natural because of the distance. I don't blame anybody, but I think also you notice in recent years, perhaps there is less of interest in understanding details about the foreign world than it was. So we will probably always be famous for not having a distinct profile. Some of our companies are, of course, not extremely Swedish. Even in Germany, people believe that Electrolux is a German company. So the only company in China that stands out as very Swedish is of course, IKEA.
Thanks a lot, Bengt. Shall we try with Börje Ljunggren again? Can you now hear us, Börje? Please go ahead and
yes, I do. Yeah.
Please go ahead and ask your question.
First, I must say to Bengt, congratulations. I think nobody else could have written the book that you have written, given your deep knowledge. And as you said, nobody has been able really to predict over the years developments ahead, and nobody could foresee what China has become. And of course, one interesting underlying issue here is China's ability to be innovative. It was supposed originally that the country couldn't be innovative, but we have seen the opposite, and we have seen also, of course, all sorts of copying and so forth. But today, Huawei has a R&D budget 3 times Ericsson's and so forth. So it's a dramatic kind of thing. But again, we see an increasingly authoritarian China. And how would you comment on the tension between the capacity to be innovative and the more increasingly deep party state and the authoritarian nature of the system, and introvert nature of the system? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Börje. That is also a rather impossible question. I don't know if I can contribute. First of all, let me say I agree completely with you that we thought China could not be innovative. We were so sort of marked by this phase of copying. I remember I talked to an overseas Chinese who said, we are not leading technology, we are followers. I didn't understand what he meant until I understood that he meant we are copying you. This is something we have to bear in mind. We all made a mistake in underestimating the innovativeness. Second question, or second part of the question is, how does it tally with an authoritarian regime? I think that in certain areas, if I now a little compare with the Soviet Union, certain areas of priority, no problem. They can be very innovative. They can have Soviet had first with a hydrogen bomb. And in last week I saw in Shanghai, they had made a breakthrough in fusion energy. I think it is possible that fusion energy will be developed in China. At least it will be developed there before it is developed in Europe. In the other softer areas, I think they have probably maybe given up a bit on the liberal sciences and so on. I don't see they are very much interested into this. I remember the last time I was in the foreign ministry in 2018, dealing with anti-corruption, there was a huge fire, and we could only extinguish the fire in central Sweden with the help of Polish fire brigade people. And there was one man who said that Poland might be behind in the theory of gender. Sweden is perhaps the leading country, but we know how to extinguish a fire. And people laughed at that and thought there's another proof that the Polish are really stupid. But if you look at it from the other side, perhaps that is a little what countries think about us. We may be number one on gender issues, but we are not so good at some other issues. Therefore, I think China will continue with the innovations in the technical issues, artificial intelligence, and so on. But I don't think we will see innovations in liberal sciences.
Thank you. Now, with great pleasure, I see a written question by my sinologist colleague, Christian Nordvall, who may be in Hong Kong. At least Christian has been doing philosophy in Hong Kong. Christian asks, what percentage of non-sinologist Swedes in China make any kind of effort to learn Chinese? It's a very straightforward question. Please.
Well, when I made my study about Swedish University enrollment, I asked how many are starting the sinologist first year and so on. Because my feeling was, if you are business-minded, maybe you don't sort of stick around a university for 5 years. You take 1 year and then you go to China or Taiwan or so and learn on the spot. So this is rather normal. If you are a PhD in Chinese, you probably remain in the university sphere. So your question was if the Swedes learn Chinese, and I think the easy way is to say they probably don't have much time. My experience to learn Chinese is that what you really need is, first of all, you need, if you drive a car, you need to read all road signs. All roads you must understand where you are. Secondly, in business, you must know the 100 Chinese family names. Because you must receive a business card and say, thank you, Mr. Chu, and you must know it is Mr. Chu and not Mr. Wang and so on. The given name is too complicated, you have to give up. So I was proud I could read all 100 family names, and I could know all streets in Shanghai. I knew how they were written, and I didn't have time to do more. This is how it is. And of course, Torbjörn knows, I see Torbjörn is laughing now. I regret I didn't study Chinese when I was young. I spent a couple of years on completely useless languages. I should have studied Chinese. And today I don't know what advice I would give to young people. But because the Chinese scene is rather different today. But I agree, if you had in your question the underlying feeling that we are not ambitious enough. Yes, you are right, we are not. And we are also not self-critical enough. We still take for granted, we have a bit of a colonial attitude that we maybe are not appreciating non-Europeans in the way we should. This is a hard lesson. It has taken me a long time to try to come over this, but it is necessary if you are out there.
Thank you. I just read the question from a junior colleague. Now I'm happy to see a very senior colleague who has raised his hand here, Tom Hart. Please, the floor is yours.
I assume you can hear me. It's been a very, very interesting discussion, and Bengt, you're much to be admired. There's one aspect which hasn't been taken up, having to do with the possibility, the ability of the Chinese to innovate and so on, and that has to do with education abroad. As we all know, an incredible number of Chinese have gone to the United States and to Western European institutions and come back with PhDs, or not come back in many times until fairly recently. Do you have any comments on that particular aspect of this thing?
Well, I have in my book an interview with Martin Pei, who we now see every evening in TV for the hybrid fossil-free steel production project. But I interviewed him when he was in Kunshan for SSAB. And he is, to my knowledge, the only Chinese person who is China-born person who is a member of the management of a Swedish company. So my feeling is that in business, it is possible for Chinese people to make a career in Sweden. If they have studied at Chalmers or KTH or something like that, they can make a career in a Swedish company. But unfortunately, it seems they are not, it's not possible for them to enter the political life. We have no Chinese person in our parliament. We have 7 Kurds and countless Greeks and so on, but no Chinese. We have no Chinese who is a mayor of a Swedish city or a provincial governor. In US, there has always been a Chinese person as one member in the president's cabinet. We have lots of mayors. So we are good at integration, talking about integration, and not so good at doing integration. But I'm happy when I talk to Martin Pei, a successful Swedish businessman, and I asked who else of Chinese people have made it into Swedish company management. And he only knew Mr. Chu Gun-yen, I think is called in the ABB for the head of robotics. But as I mentioned, of course, ABB is no longer a Swedish company. But he said it is easier for us to work in business than it is in the public administration. And I think that when we look at universities, the attraction, I think this is well known by the Chinese. They will still like to come and study at KTH, KI, and Chalmers. And we might see fewer number in other universities.
Thank you, Bengt. I can still remember Martin Pei when he came here as a young student. I think he was part of the first group of Chinese students to arrive here after the Cultural Revolution. It's a very inspiring, he must be a very inspiring example to many other Chinese. Our hour is really up, but my colleague Emilia tells me that we can continue at least until 11:15. So I will hasten to read one more question from Marianne Lanatza, who writes, "Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I have two questions, comments. First, did the Western companies underestimate the strong development within education regarding the growing number of technical experts? And second, how do you look at the future of the WTO, since China and India, etc., have got much stronger positions in the future negotiations?"
Two questions. I always start with the second one, and then I ask you again what the first one was. On WTO, I think the recent alliance China-India in Glasgow is perhaps not a WTO issue. I think in WTO, the rule is when you are at the top, you agree with everybody, disagree with everybody. EU and US were at the top and disagreed on everything, on airplanes, hormones, bananas, and so on. If China and India will rise to be chief spokesmen in some way of the WTO, you will see disagreements between them. It is impossible to avoid this kind of protectionism. Otherwise, I think in the last 10 years, China has been a very strong supporter of WTO and of free trade. And now this might change and we might see another trade policy. And about India, I mean, nobody knows, because on one hand, they insist on burning coal. On the other hand, yesterday you saw on TV that you can't go out in the streets in New Delhi any longer because it's so polluted. I think if as soon as you discuss WTO, you must understand that companies have a nationalist policy, and they have the American saying, where you stand depends on where you sit. That's how it is. May I ask you again the first question?
Did the Western companies underestimate the strong development within education regarding the growing number of technical experts?
I don't want to generalize because again, what we talk about is if we did this perhaps 20, 30 years ago, and at that time, as you saw on my chart, most of our exports was telecommunications. So we always look at Ericsson case in this case. In other issues, we are not quite sure. But it is for sure that Swedish companies underestimated the ability of the Chinese to sort of step up their technology. I recall in 1970s when we had the teching seminars, we had a meeting before we went to China. We told all companies, if you get the question, what type of steel do you have in your product? Is it 3, 4, 5 millimeter thick and so on? Don't answer, because they are going to want to copy you. And the companies looked at us and, oh, you really mean that? Yeah, we mean that. That's how it is. So we did underestimate, and that lies in the nature of maybe a Swedish nature, or in the nature of when you deal with somebody who is not developed. I remember people were asking me, is it right that Sweden will give soft credits to China? They could overtake us. And I said, China has not asked us for a single dollar, quite opposite to African countries who ask us for more and more. China has accepted soft credits. That's the only way we use development budget for China. And we should be happy that they don't base their economy on foreign development assistance. They base the economy on their own ability. More countries should do that. So there was such a discussion early on. I also remember first day when I worked in the government secretariat, I was given a draft bill to Parliament to introduce GSP, Generalized System of Preferences, to China. And there was a lot of then comments by stakeholders, and I think the organization of Mrs. Lanatsa was one, Board of Commerce, that said that, yeah, we must have possibilities to stop imports from China, because today they are small exporters to Sweden. Tomorrow they are still small, but in 50 years' time they could conquer out all of other exporters because of their size and their energy. And I thought, oh my God, thinking 50 years ahead, how can somebody do that? But they were right. I mean, you have to think very far ahead if you want to avoid risks. And some of our institutions could do that. Companies, of course, already then had a rather shorter perspective. Today, maybe it is a quarterly profit report. Back then, it was perhaps 2 or 3 years. And in that perspective, it's very easy to underestimate. Thank you.
Thank you again. We now have 2 more questions registered, and I think these will have to be the final questions. After that, I will ask Bengt also to make some final comments. Now we have a question from another old, if not China, so at least Asia hand, Mr. Uno Svedin, who writes, on the educational capacity transfer, for example, English language courses for Chinese. I have an anecdote from the early 1990s. I was sitting in a park on the outskirts of Canton. On the bench, I was joined by a young 16-year-old boy. He asked if he could try to speak English to me. I was delighted. And he was communicating quite well. I asked him how he could have gotten such a skill. And he said that he was listening every evening to radio or to an English program on radio at his grandmother's place. My greatest surprise was his grasp of the British content, especially his knowledge of the escort race course details. It was obvious that his English capacity did not only provide an Oxford dialect, an Oxford accent, but also a British reality view of the world. So at that time, the Chinese society promoted such language radio programs transmitted for free type of education, also for a normal worker. Well, this was a comment perhaps rather than a question, but would you like to make a comment on that, Bengt?
Times have changed. We all know the period, of course, when a lot of people could learn, had full access, and so on. We have not that much similar interest today. I recall one event where we thought that we were going to give a good presentation of Swedish culture, and that was launching the first translation of Stig Larsson's trilogy on I think it's something with dragon and fire and so on. Anyhow, you know Stig Larsson. And it has been a tremendous success in countries like Spain. It was one of the best-selling foreign books. In China, the interest was low. And a lot of Chinese came up to me afterwards and said, "We thought your country was an honest, crime-free country. Now you have given us this book that shows us that it is extremely criminal and dangerous country to be in. You have a problem there. I mean, do you really want to make propaganda, or do you want to present a more idealized picture of your country?" I think the days are over when you have people that have this fairy tale image of your country and follow these details. I never met any Chinese who follow Swedish details. I remember I was in Vietnam, and on a beach I met a Vietnamese who knew everything about Mona Sahlins credit card problems back in late 90s. He had read everything. No, I didn't meet any such Chinese people.
And I think the last question will go to Ola Wong. And may I ask you, Ola, if you are still with us to
Indeed, I am.
Orally.
Hello.
Yes, hello. Perhaps you can take your question orally.
Well, it's two questions. The social credit system for companies back in last year, actually, Business Sweden said that the social credit system for companies will affect every companies in China and Swedish company as well. And I wonder, what is your thoughts about that? I also wonder if you could elaborate a bit about what you call the hostage situation with Ericsson.
Sorry, which situation did you say?
You mentioned earlier, you said hostage situation with Ericsson.
Oh, I see. I don't know if I intended to say that, but let me first say on the social credit system, it is of course always delayed, but strong forces that it will be introduced. It will also cover foreign companies. The extremely complicated issue I think it will be maybe delayed again and again. But I have no doubt that it will be implemented, and it could become problematic for foreign companies, because then they suddenly have to fulfill the requirements to get a high score. And I have not seen yet how these requirements are. What we have seen from places where the trial activities have been undertaken for individuals is that this grading of people, good and bad and so on, is nearly like the 1984 by George Orwell. This is not the kind of society we hope to live in. On the second question you have here about Ericsson hostage, I only associate with Canada. Hostage policy. Ericsson, no, Ericsson is not a hostage. Ericsson's problem is they get a smaller and smaller part of the market. China's telecom market is the biggest telecom market in the world. It's a problem if you are not there, and Swedish government has perhaps not been helpful. Ericsson says, why don't you just do like Finland, that you avoid Chinese suppliers, but you don't say that they are blocked? Why don't you do that? I don't know if that is possible. That is beyond my my sort of competence right now to judge. But I think the important problem for Ericsson in the future is, will they be part of standard setting for 6G? This is in Swedish national interest. I really hope outstanding problems can be sorted out. Standardization should not be politicized, but it is so important that politicians have difficulty to stay away from the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When you are doing something really interesting, time passes very quickly. We have already been going on for, this has lasted for almost 1 hour and 20 minutes, so we should now soon come to an end. But would you now, at the end, Bengt, like to make some concluding remarks, perhaps?
Thank you. I think I should be very short, and I'll take up one issue that is, I think not only I'm feeling, but people of my age, and that is, how do we find equal footing with young colleagues? Of course, you can't say like this, what you are proposing, we tried 30 years ago, by the way, before you were born, we failed then, and you are going to fail now, and so on. No, they don't listen. They think you are dinosaur. What I said then, I will just shut up. And if somebody asked me, how is it to work with people who are so much younger? I said, it's complicated because I carry a big load of unnecessary knowledge. And then they asked us, as I had hoped for, what kind of knowledge is unnecessary? And I said, my first 20 years were how to work in the Cold War situation, how to handle relations with a powerful neighbor and a powerful military bloc around the corner. That after the Berlin Wall fell is meaningless, it's out of date. And now suddenly it pops up again. We might face a Cold War. We have very strong tensions between US and China. And there are so many things I remember from the period when I started my professional activity during the Cold War. So I think this is no longer a useless knowledge. This is important. The second thing is, this sounds perhaps very pessimistic, but I must also say that on a personal level, I have never had problems of negotiating or have problems with the Chinese authorities. They listen to good arguments. That's my opinion. One can achieve a lot just by being serious and not looking down on them and taking their issues seriously. I want our people not to give up. We should continue improve ourselves, our knowledge, learn and study, and sooner or later this will be useful again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bengt. And then for me, it remains only on behalf of the Stockholm China Center to thank Bengt for your really extremely interesting and illuminating lecture, and also to thank the attendees for your active participation. I hope you will keep your eyes open for future lectures and other activities which we advertise on our homepage. But for now, thank you and have a good afternoon. Goodbye.